Good morning, how are you? Defense, what is the plan for this morning?
Calling Dr. Marraccini, a forensic pathologist first, then we have a number of much shorter witnesses, and then we wrap up.
Okay. Is Ms. Ellis here, or did you?
Yes, Your Honor, she's just going to be stepping in just a minute.
Okay, did you want me to wait a moment, or?
I'm around, yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Are there any preliminary things we need to deal with before Mr. Fernandez goes?
Any issues?
No, I don't think so, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor,
Yes.
during Dr. Marraccini's testimony, we've got this little toy gun that he's going to use to demonstrate a few things. It's a gun I've used in about 2 other murder trials, but took an act of Congress to get it in yesterday, but we got it in. I wanted to just show it to everybody to assure everyone it's not a real gun. And
Okay, Andy, you want to take a look?
Would you like to see it, Your Honor?
I think the deputy's going to take a look at it for a second. Thank you. Okay, all right. That's fine, Mr. Lubin.
Thank you.
All right, so call your witness, please.
Call Dr. John Marraccini.
Good morning, sir. Okay, Mr. Lubin, when you're ready, you may inquire.
May it please the court, good morning. Dr. Marraccini, could you please state your full name?
My name is Dr. John Marraccini, Marraccini.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a forensic pathologist and consultant, and I'm also a family practice physician.
What is your educational background up through getting your medical degree?
I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Miami, and then in 75, and then I graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1978. After that, I completed 5 years of essentially residency and fellowship at the University of Miami in the Dade County Medical Examiner's Office. I was an associate medical examiner in Dade County. After that, I came up here to Palm Beach County in '83, and I worked first as an associate medical examiner, then deputy chief medical examiner, and chief medical examiner here in Palm Beach County, Florida. After a period of time, I came down to Miami and continued to work as a forensic consultant and a family practice physician. At various times, I've been a professor, as voluntary professor at the University of Miami School of Medicine in the Department of Pathology, Florida International University School of Medicine, Department of Pathology, and Florida International University, Department of Family Practice. I'm an author of 10 research papers, one of which is relevant here, and that is of gunshot wound of the chest in living victims. That was a study conducted at the Ryder Trauma Center.
Have you, I mean, I know the answer, but have you been qualified in forensic pathology to testify in the courts of the state of Florida?
Yes, I've been court qualified to testify about various matters with gunshot wounds, wound ballistics, wound trajectory, human activity after being shot, blood loss issues, internal wounding, and that's in a number of counties in Florida.
And elsewhere?
I've been court qualified in the Commonwealth of Virginia in terms of gunshot wound issues. I've also been court qualified in California and Alaska on other forensic matters and in federal courts.
Do you have an estimate of how many times you've testified in cases in the state of Florida dealing with issues relating to forensic pathology?
Well, I've testified hundreds of times for the state and probably hundreds of times for the defense in a variety of matters involving forensic pathology in the state of Florida.
And do you have any kind of estimate on how often that testimony related to gunshot wounds?
Well, testimony in court, currently, it would be, once or twice a year.
That's in recent times.
Recent times.
What about when you were involved as a medical examiner at different
Well,
levels?
as a medical examiner in Palm Beach, of course, a lot of that related to homicides and gunshot wounds. So, 4 or 5 times a year while I was up here in Palm Beach County, I testified in court. That's in addition to, of course, depositions, grand jury testimony, other things.
And just for your edification, we're in a non-jury hearing. These are spectators that are sitting over here, just so that you understand that. Has your testimony included the designation as someone who is qualified to talk about the human dynamics of the human body during the receipt of gunshot wounds, including positions, how the wounds may or may not have occurred, etc.?
Right. I'm in court qualified to testify about things that happened before, during, and after receiving gunshot injuries.
And have you are you familiar with with the literature in that field?
I am.
Okay. And have you written in that field
Yes.
for publication?
Yes. It was published in a surgical journal. It was a discussion of blood pressure changes after gunshot wounds of the chest.
Do you have a notation as to when you were contacted by, or approximately when you were contacted by my office in this case and supplied information to review?
I received materials initially on this case on July 29 of 2016. I think the contact was several days earlier.
And did you review the materials that you received at that time?
Well, I was reviewing materials, the initial group of materials, and then additional materials as they came through.
So just to touch on a few, if I leave any of the important ones out, let me know. Were you given the autopsy report and photos in this case?
Yes, I was.
That autopsy report that I'm referring to was one authored by Dr. Just.
That is correct.
Okay. Were you given the forensic pathological reports of Dr. Thogmartin in this case?
Yes, I reviewed both their reports and ultimately their depositions.
And you say there also Dr. Nelson?
Dr. Nelson and Dr. Thogmartin.
Okay. And in ultimately coming to a conclusion in this case, did you take into account those 3 forensic pathology reports and the depositions of those 3 forensic pathologists?
I did, of course, in addition to a whole lot of other documents, photos. I went to the scene of the incident.
And why did you go to the scene of the incident?
Well, I mean, it's nice to understand the physicality, as a cliche, the lay of the land, the elevation of the road, the swale, grass, other surfaces, physical distances. So I think it's useful to go to the scene even after, the body is not there anymore.
And did you familiarize yourself with the type of ammunition or the size of the ammunition and the type of weapon that was used to inflict the wounds in this case?
I did.
And in addition to that, do you have more than a passing knowledge in firearms and their use yourself?
Right. I mean, in addition to working with wounds and things, I've independently conducted certain tests with firearms, like ejection pattern testing, and use that in terms of the position of the shooter relevant to, by looking at where the ejected cartridge casings are on the ground and so forth. And I've done some, other bench testing where I've done range of fire determinations using pigskin and a firearm and some other things. So
Now-
I've done, and that work has been accepted by the courts.
Now, not going to ask you about any testing in that regard in this case, but you're generally familiar with the operation of the Glock 27?
That's right.
Okay. And have you reviewed the materials to know that that's the firearm in this case?
It is.
Okay. Could you please describe for Her Honor the wounds in any particular order that you want to, but please describe the wounds and maybe using your own body to demonstrate the actual position so that we can have it on a real person.
Okay. You mind if I remove my jacket, Your Honor? Okay, so in this particular individual, we have three gunshot wounds, one of which is what we call a penetrating wound, which means it went in but it didn't come out. So there's an entrance hole where my right hand is.
And you're pointing, just for the record, to describe where on your torso you're pointing to.
On the right side of the chest towards the front. And this is where the bullet went in. It went inside the body, hit various things, lung, aorta, pulmonary artery, and wound up lodging in this general area between my hand, sort of in the region of the shoulder.
And you described that as a penetrating wound?
Right, it went in, but then stopped inside the body.
So my first question, as to that wound, was that the wound that was responsible for the death?
Yes, that's the lethal wound.
Where were the other two wounds?
This individual has a through-and-through injury. It strikes the back of this arm.
Which arm is that, for the record? The right arm?
The back of the right arm, and comes out in the front of the right arm, and it goes, back to front and slightly upwards through the arm, not doing any significant damage.
Was that a soft tissue wound?
Yeah, this is a soft tissue injury where the bone was not struck. So this is a through and through, so we call this a perforating gunshot wound.
And then number 3?
And then finally, to the left arm, let's see how I can position this. There is a through and through wound that comes through the arm more or less sideways, and this breaks the bone in the forearm. This is not an immediately lethal wound, but for purposes of holding and using a firearm with the left hand, this would disable the left arm.
Very well. And when you say where it entered, just so that, for the record, so that it's clear, how would you describe the part of the arm that it entered?
Okay, it enters, we call it the ulnar side, the side opposite the thumb, and it goes through the forearm sideways and comes out on the thumb side of the arm.
Now, I take it you're not able to determine which of the wounds occurred in what order. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Now, I guess the first issue I'd like you to be able to address is to describe the position relative to the barrel of the gun, for example, that the body would have had to have been in for each of these 3 shots. You had mentioned you might want to use the easel for that. If you do,
Okay.
it's set up for you with some markers.
All right.
But why don't you first just tell us verbally and maybe demonstrate using your own, your own body, the relative position that the body would have been into to the firearm. And you've got the little orange and yellow toy gun there. It might be a little different than a real gun, but it's what we're allowed to bring into court.
All right, let me try to fix it so the top doesn't stick up so much.
Yeah. Do we have any Scotch tape?
No, we're good.
You good? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I had a cap pistol with the same problem when I was a kid, but,
Okay.
all right, so what we have is an individual receiving a gunshot wound, I'm sorry, Your Honor, on this side.
And just for the record, we've got to always say what side we're talking
On
about.
the right side of the chest, a little towards the front, is the entrance defect of a penetrating gunshot wound to the chest. And this round comes from right to left and somewhat upward. So one would typically expect in this particular scenario, one of two things, that either the shooter is lower than the person being shot, or that more likely scenario is that the torso is leaning somewhat backwards. So when we say upwards with the body like this, but not upwards in terms of what's actually happening with the ground.
When you say the body like this, I just want
I'm sorry, with the body in the so-called anatomic position as we see them in the medical examiner's office lying on the table.
Okay.
But of course, that's not what's going on in the real world. So now, if we have a trajectory that's coming upward across the body, as my right arm is showing, then in order to make that parallel to the ground, the upper body has to be tilted, or the torso has to be tilted. And then when the torso is tilted, now the bullet flight is more or less parallel to the ground. So that's probably what's going on here, that you have the upper torso tilted and a bullet is traversing the chest at that moment. So what is described as being upward in the autopsy protocol is in fact more or less parallel to the ground.
Now, please describe for Her Honor what that bullet did internally from your review of the autopsy report and Dr. Just's deposition and the photographs.
Well, what we know is that this bullet entered and clips the top of the right sixth rib, and it then goes through the right lung. It goes through part of the heart called the right atrium, which is one of the four chambers, and it goes through the aorta, which is the major artery coming off the top of the heart, and it goes through the pulmonary artery, which is another major artery coming off the top of the heart. It goes then through the left lung, goes out the space, well, it basically clips the left fourth rib and winds up in the soft tissues of the upper arm, more or less where the tip of my finger is pointing.
So could you just describe for the record what the tip of your finger was pointing to?
The tip of my finger is pointing to an area where the shoulder and the arm more or less meet together, but it's the actual location of the bullet is deeper inside than the tip of my finger.
And is that the wound that you've determined to be the fatal wound?
Right. I think all the experts agree that this is the fatal injury.
So are wounds such as that described throughout the literature?
No, sure. I mean, ever since firearms came into common use 500-600 years ago, there's been gunshot wounds of the chest, some of which have struck the major vessels and or the heart.
And this, I take it, is one of them.
And this is one of them. And the effects of these wounds are well described.
So I want to ask you, anatomically, if that's the correct word, upon receipt of that wound, what do we know about the physical capabilities of the victim, the person that got shot?
Well, look, I think you're asking what could someone do having received this particular gunshot wound as in this particular case.
Yes.
Well, the answer, first of all, that blood pressure is going to drop fairly rapidly. There's no question about that. And now the limitation in terms of human activity is how quickly does the brain run out of oxygen? Let's assume the worst case scenario that the blood pressure is immediately close to zero. Even with that scenario, you have 10 or 15 seconds of oxygen left in the brain with which the brain can do something. And so individuals in the literature for decades, and even before then in literature in Europe, they've been described as, being able to run a couple city blocks up and down stairs, things that you wouldn't think were possible when you have this kind of cardiovascular injury, but yet it is possible. And typically those individuals are those who are already in a so-called fearful or activated state or agitated state. In other words, an individual who is just sitting there reading a book and collects this kind of gunshot wound doesn't jump up and run a city block. But an individual who's already up and running for whatever reason and fully activated for whatever reason is the kind of individual who is able to sustain activity after this lethal gunshot wound.
So, starting at the beginning, are we talking about somebody who was going to fall right there in place and be incapacitated?
Well, what they actually do and what is possible are of course, things both to consider, but they are capable of going a considerable distance, a city block, up and down stairs. They can survive for an extensive period of time. Vincent DeMeo is one of the...
Yeah, let me just get you to address me on this.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Vincent DeMeo is one of the premier forensic pathologists, and he's written 3 editions of a book on gunshot wounds, one that most medical examiners refer to. And, he describes someone with a very similar gunshot wound to this individual, a young person and so forth, and that individual is refusing to go to the emergency room. Finally, after 30 minutes of arguing, fire paramedics insisted he go, and his vital signs were normal upon arrival in the emergency room. And it was only after a delay of another 15 minutes, total 45 minutes, that this individual began to go into shock. So there's a variety of reasons why it's possible for an injury, even going through the aorta and pulmonary artery, to not immediately cause sudden collapse. So the period is even longer than the 10 to 15 minutes in some individuals with this.
The 10 to 15 seconds.
I'm sorry, there's longer than 10 to 15 seconds, as we talked about in terms of running out of oxygen in the brain. Strangely enough, there's some individuals who go on and on for many, many minutes before the effect suddenly happens to them. So it's hard to predict in an individual case, which of those scenarios will play out.
But at a minimum, that the 10 to 15 seconds is how long it takes for the brain to understand that there's no oxygen coming to it?
It's lights out at 10 to 15 seconds, with the brain running out of oxygen. The question is now, what someone does during the 10 to 15 seconds is the kind of thing that people evaluate further with other circumstantial information.
In your experience as a forensic pathologist and medical doctor, have you seen injuries such as this and injuries such as this where the person was able to travel a good distance?
Yes.
And if I just gave you a hypothetical, would traveling 166 feet be within the normal realm of possibility?
Yes.
Are there instances where there would be more or less blood loss from a wound such as this?
Well, the blood loss is, people bleed internally and then they bleed externally from gunshot wounds. How much blood is going to be on the inside versus the outside has something to do with whether the hole of entrance is covered up by the slippage of muscles in tissues sideways as the body posture changes. And if I could just use the toy gun here. I don't want to point at anyone in particular, so I'll just point it over there.
Okay.
All right, so if your arm is raised, you receive a gunshot wound. It goes across the chest, there's a hole. If the arm stayed in this exact position, then that hole is going to be a hole. And when the bleeding starts, you're going to begin to leak some blood out of the chest, and you may get a blood trail. But if after receiving this, the arm comes down, and for instance, someone is running, now the tissues are in a different place. The muscles are in a different place, the fat's in a different place. So this things between the skin and the hole in the chest slide down a little bit and can cover up the hole going through the chest wall. And that's where the blood's going to come out and through. So the point is, strangely enough, people can have these kinds of injuries, but they don't necessarily leave a blood trail that you can follow. And you know, most of the blood may be found only after the point of collapse. And so whether you do or do not leave a blood trail in the presence of this kind of lethal gunshot wound is an iffy thing.
Not an indication necessarily of where the individual was when he received that wound.
That's correct.
Now, while you're standing up, and if you want to use the easel that you've got set up over there, just tell us and feel free to do that. I would like to go through some scenarios as to the body position and arm position that would have made access to that entry possible. And I think what I'd like to discuss is gun raised in the right hand, gun raised in the left hand, gun raised in one hand but supported by the other hand. So I'd like you first, and just facing me if you choose, because I think that would be easiest for the judge and the state attorneys to see it. Could you describe, let's start with the scenario as described by Officer Raja in his walkthrough video of the deceased having the gun in his right hand and not the left, his right hand, and no description of the left hand or the left arm supporting it. So the gun in the right hand. Could you demonstrate for us, as an example, the arm position with the gun in it that would assume for a moment, I guess, that I'm the... Let me take that front one, okay? Assume for a second that the gun is at my location. Okay, I know you're higher than me. If you want to come down, that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, so let's just assume, sorry to be pointing this at you, but let's just assume for a moment
We need to
that...
use the handheld microphone so that we can make sure we pick it up.
Let's just assume for a second that that microphone is your gun and you're holding that gun. And what position would your right arm be in to open the body up to a shot that entered at the location you've been describing?
Assume that I'm the person receiving the gunshot.
Yes.
Well, first of all, you know, if your arms are like this, your arm's going to get in the way of the hole of entrance. So the arm has to be somewhere else. Above would be a typical example.
So you're holding your arm more or less parallel to the ground and your right arm straight out?
There's one obvious example, you know, there's a lot of different ways they describe this. Sorry. My apologies, Your Honor. turn this off. I apologize.
Okay.
All right, so there's a lot of different variations. You can call this the dueling position. You can call this the Olympic target shooting position. But the arm is more or less fully extended, maybe slightly bent, but elevated, bringing the gun and the sights up to the eye level.
And in order for the wound to take the path that it did, would I have to be more in line with your side when you turned around like that in order for the wound to traverse?
Correct. So
More or
once
less
again,
where I am.
the arm raised, sights brought up to eye level, and in this particular case, leaning backwards because we had to get the torso shot to go parallel to the ground because you're receiving fire now. So this is just one of many scenarios that takes the gun arm away from the hole of entrance.
Let's go through a couple of other potential scenarios, okay? With the gun being held in that same right arm, but with it also being supported by the left arm.
Right. I mean, there's a variety of variations of this with the arms raised, both arms raised essentially, supporting the firearm. There's a so-called teacup hold, which is not particularly used by law enforcement that much, but is used by others.
And again, in order for it to traverse through the body would have to be sideways to the barrel of the
Right. I
gun.
mean, that's the main limitation. The body has to be sideways more or less and tilted, leaning away from the action.
Now, without a video of what happened, are there various combinations of fluidity? In other words, with the person receiving the wound to be in motion when he received that wound, that would result in that type of path through the body.
Right. I mean, if someone's running and then pivots to attempt to deliver a shot, then the torso is tilted, and that kind of thing can happen.
And in general, there could be any varying numbers of twisting, turning, but
Correct.
I guess the key is at the moment that the bullet is fired, the location of that right side has to be exposed, and it has to be at an angle that would be in accordance with the slight upward trajectory that you described.
Right. We basically would like to create a scenario where the bullet is traveling parallel to the ground and try to make that work in a reconstruction.
Could the upward trajectory also be caused by the shooter holding the gun low and aiming up?
Right. If they're sufficiently close at the time of discharge of the weapon, then if as an example, the officer is bringing the gun up from the waist and beginning to initiate gunfire from down below, then you could get some upward trajectory in that regard.
Now, while you're down, there were two other wounds that Mr. Jones received. One, you said, to the right arm, one to the left arm. Could you now demonstrate, now that you're down here, the relative location of the body of Mr. Jones's body to the firearm that was firing the shots on those two?
Well, once again, we don't know that the gun is still, we don't know the order of shots, and we don't even know whether there was a separation in time, but what we have is a round that comes through the back of the arm and comes out. So once again, in order to present this, it would be typical that either the arm is turned this way.
That way meaning?
I'm sorry, the right arm is rotated inward at the shoulder. And by rotating inward at the shoulder now, what seems to be a back to front or upward can actually be a horizontal trajectory coming across the body if the right arm is, for instance, if the right shoulder is rotated forward and the right arm is there. Now the weapon could still be held in the right hand, But now, you know, it's less likely at this exact moment that the weapon is pointed at the shooter because of the trajectory I'm showing you. Other possibilities would be that the arm, of course, is down and the round is going through. But the point is as soon as you put the right upper arm, rotate the shoulder forward and have the right upper arm parallel to the ground, perpendicular to the front of the chest, then trajectories exist that'll take the round through the upper arm, through and through, in and out, going from back to front.
Now, you know, when we describe these, of course, you're static and you're not in motion, but in real life, the person receiving the wound could be in all kinds of fluid motion and the shot just catches the person at a point in time.
Well, I mean, theoretically, you're trying to be, you're not trying to be a stationary target, let's put it that way, when someone's shooting at you.
Okay. Now, what about the wound to the left arm?
All right, well, the wound to the left arm, as we previously mentioned, traverses the arm, going from the side opposite to the thumb side, and breaks a bone in the arm and disables the arm. So, once again, if it's a right-handed shooter and the left hand happens to be up, then you could certainly traverse the arm, the left forearm, you know, independent of all the other shots. You could collect a shot here, collect a shot through the forearm while the shooter is still in this position, theoretically.
I take it there's just dozens of possibilities. But is it possible, for example, from your review of the pathology in this case, that the arm shots were not received at the same time as the chest wound?
That's correct.
And if the gun were held in the left hand when that left arm injury occurred, would it likely result in the gun falling to the ground? Dropping?
Well, it would disable the left forearm. When exactly it left the hand is another question, but it wouldn't be unreasonable for the firearm to very quickly fall out of the left hand, having received this through-and-through gunshot wound to the arm.
And regarding the person receiving any of these wounds, is there would the pathology suggest that that person might have fallen down at some point and gotten back up and continued on?
Well, I don't have any evidence one way or the other whether they staggered, got down, and got up again.
Well, let me ask you hypothetically concerning the statement that Officer Raja gave in describing the second three shots that he fired. He said that the person dropped something silver, fell down, and then got up and ran. Possibilities?
Sure.
Would there be any reason why the person could not have gotten up and, based on the scenario you've described about how these injuries work, would there be any reason to suggest that the person could not have gotten back up and run no matter whether he received the fatal wound in the first volley or the second volley?
He can get back up.
Okay. Now, you haven't described how the wound to the right side of the chest could have occurred if the person had the gun in his left hand. You've described it in his right hand with both the without support of the left and in the right hand with support of the left. But let's talk about how the person could have received that wound, saying hypothetically that the firearm that he was carrying was being held in his left hand.
All right, so the firearm is in the left hand. And once again, whether, if this is independent or connected to the others or not, it requires a posture of the forearm, such as I'm illustrating here, where the forearm is pointed up and tilted a bit, and the round comes through. With the upper body tilt, the round comes through the arm, through and through.
Okay, you're talking about the left arm shot. So
The left arm shot.
Also about the right arm shot with the gun being held in the left hand. The gun being held in the left hand and the right arm shot.
In the right arm shot, it just depends what's going on with this hand. This arm could be used in a supporting manner to brace the left arm. The right arm could be used in a supporting manner to brace the left arm, and it still gives the same result. So if an individual is in a posture more or less like this, you could even conceive a situation where he receives all 3 shots and all the trajectories work, and, everything fits with the missiles passing parallel to the ground, traversing the right upper arm, the left forearm, and the chest. With
Three
the gun in the
three
left-
separate shots, right?
3 separate shots, but all 3 happening in one singular volley could even do this.
So, again, on the fatal wound, demonstrate for Her Honor, please, how if the gun were being held by Mr. Jones in his left hand, some examples of how he could have received the fatal wound to his right side. Gun being
Well, yeah,
held.
but why don't you be the shooter there so we could get some little bit of perspective? So the answer is the right side of the body is presented for the lethal shot crossing the chest. It's parallel to the ground, so there's backward tilt, and there's bracing of the weapon in the manner that I'm showing.
In other words, the weapon being held in the person's left hand and the right hand assisting in steadying the gun.
Right, so you could wind up with all 3 shots with the person receiving the shots in the position I'm showing you. Now this looks awkward as a static event, but if you're running and you receive shots, then what you're looking at is a snapshot of someone running, tilting away from the shooter.
Right.
And it's possible that all 3 rounds are received, and it's consistent with the trajectories found in deceased.
Or not necessarily all at the same time.
Not necessarily at the same time, but if you had to put it together in one volley of 3 shots with all 3 wounds, you could even do it that way.
So it could be in one volley of 3 shots, it could be either of the first volley of 3 shots. All 3 could have been at once, or it could have been 2 during one volley and 1 during another volley. Is that basically accurate? There's just no way of knowing.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Okay, but I'd like to just focus now not on the 2 arm shots, but on the fatal wound, okay? With the gun being held in various locations but in the left hand, just what would the relative position of the right arm have to be in to open the person to that fatal wound?
Well, it's easier to say what it can't be. It can't be in the left. So if the right arm is like this, down into the side and cover, and it can't be over the hole of entrance. So it's either got to be behind it, well in front of it, or above it. Okay, in the manner that I just.
So let's start with the first one. If the right arm were behind it, could you demonstrate that for Her Honor, please?
All right, so.
Let's just say the gun is.
All right, so he's receiving the right-sided gunshot injury. One of these looking back scenarios.
Gun in the left hand.
Gun in left hand, as an example.
And is that, the position you're in right now would have opened the body to the
Right.
wound?
It exposes the entrance hole on the right side of the chest slightly to the front, because now the right arm is clear.
So that would be consistent with the fatal wound?
Yes.
Let's take another scenario, and again in the left hand. Another one where the fatal wound could have occurred.
Well, the fatal wound could be received once again, and the arm could be in the air.
Up, and you're holding your
Right.
right arm.
So the right arm is elevated,
Right.
and once again, these are it may look awkward or unusual, but once again, these are dynamic situations where, people are turning back to address the situation, and they collect gunfire.
And what about the situation that you talked about? I'm not sure you demonstrated with the right arm being used to support the left arm holding the gun, or the right arm being used to support the left arm holding the gun.
Once again, it's a run. and, run in position like this instantaneously in time. It allows gunfire to go through all three spots in the body, the bullets running parallel to the ground. But it doesn't have to be simultaneously, but if it was, that would be one example.
And could the gun also be pointed towards me, being held in the left hand, and the injury to the right side occurred?
Well, yeah, this is all instantaneous. It could start out by this and then turn and pivot. In the twinkling of an eye, the gun's gone from this position to this position.
Or what about just simply aimed towards me with the left hand supporting, the right hand supporting it?
Well, if it's aimed, the bullet trajectories don't work unless there's some leaning and twisting.
You're assuming the arm shots at the same time.
If the arm shots at the same time. But of course, as long as the arms are raised, the gun is in the left hand and supported. As long as the arms are out of the way, of course you could receive the gunshot wound entering the right side of the chest without touching the arms at all. The arms are out of the way of the chest shot.
Okay. Have a seat. So again, I know you've sort of said this, but I just want to make sure that it's clear. We're taking moments in time, but with a body in fluid motion, there's any number of various positions that these shots could have occurred in that would have been consistent with what the autopsy demonstrated, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that you relied, in your opinion, not only on your own experience and the literature, but also on the statements made both in deposition and in reports of the other three forensic pathologists.
That is correct.
Okay. First, concerning Dr. Joost, who was the medical examiner in this case, you've read her materials, correct?
I have.
And do you agree with her conclusion that the fatal wound would have been immediately incapacitating and that the person would have dropped almost immediately?
I do not.
Do you agree with Dr. Nelson and Dr. Thogmartin, who say what you say, that the person could have traveled a good distance after receiving the fatal wound?
I agree with that.
And is there anything about either of their reports or sworn testimony that is inconsistent with what you say? They, meaning Thogmartin and Nelson?
No, there is not.
So what is inconsistent is the testimony and the report of Dr. Joost?
That is correct.
And you're just saying she's just plain wrong?
She's wrong about the immediate effect of the gunshot wound causing incapacitation.
And does the literature written up on this support your and Dr. Thogmartin and Dr. Nelson's opinions and not hers?
I'm going to object to both one.
Rule for no.
Well, all the literature I've seen gives many examples and supports the notion that it takes a while for people to be incapacitated by a cardiothoracic gunshot.
Thank you. Your indulgence? Thank you. No further questions of this witness.
Okay, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Marraccini.
Good morning, ma'am.
First, I want to just start with some of the examples that you gave a few minutes ago on direct examination. You talked about people being able to run a flight of, I believe you said that people who sustain these type of injuries already up and running would continue to be able to engage in that activity. They're capable of running city blocks, correct?
Well, that was one of the examples cited by Nelson. Yes, and the answer is yes.
Okay. Now, in those examples that you just gave us, now the caliber of weapon that was used in those examples? For instance, a person who you're saying is able to continue to run a city block after sustaining a gunshot wound to the heart.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm not talking about some phantom person. I'm talking about the same exact injury as Corey Jones sustained. Are you saying that a person who received that same exact type of injury is capable of running a city block, is capable, although he is already in motion, is capable of continuing to exert that same activity?
Yes.
Okay. And does it matter the caliber of weapon that's used? And what I mean by caliber, I mean, for instance, there are 22 caliber guns, there are 38 caliber guns, and this weapon in this case was a 40 caliber gun, correct?
Right. I think the examples that were cited by Nelson, Thogmartin, myself, specifically mentioned at least some of them being like 38 caliber handguns.
Okay. So now, the examples that you gave for Your Honor a few minutes ago, none of those examples included a 40 caliber Glock, a 40 caliber weapon, correct?
No.
And a 40 caliber is a much larger, in terms of the size of that bullet, is a much larger bullet than a 22, than a 38, than a 32.
It's not much larger. The difference between the actual caliber of 38 special is 36.
But you would agree that it's a larger, it's
Right, and then, so the caliber of the Glock is 40, so it's the difference between 36 hundredths of an inch and 40 hundredths of an inch in diameter. That's the difference. But yeah, the 40 is bigger than 36.
Okay. When you were, well, before I get to that, let me talk to you about this a little bit. Now, a lot of the demonstration that you gave obviously presupposes that Corey Jones had some of the demonstration you gave. You had the gun in your right hand. And based on the gun being in your right hand, you said that is what opened up that area within his torso that would have allowed the bullet to traverse, to go into that side, and then go in through the pulmonary aorta and basically lacerate those arteries, those veins, correct?
That's right.
Now, when you were demonstrating a few minutes ago, someone with the gun in their left hand,
Mm-hmm.
and in this case, did you know whether or not Corey Jones was left-handed or right-handed?
It's my understanding he's reported as left-handed.
Okay. So now, and can I borrow that microphone you were using as?
No problem.
When you were demonstrating a few minutes ago, some of the positions that you actually had to use in order for you to sort of explain that it is possible that these are the ways in which Corey could have sustained the injury to that fatal injury, is you had the gun in this position at all times.
Yeah, it was angled up. Correct.
Right. So now, if someone is shooting at someone, for instance, in this case, as the defendant has said that Corey was pointing the gun at him.
Right.
And it was reported that we know that Corey is left-handed, right?
Yes.
But one of the demonstrations that you used was that, okay, let's say he has the gun in his left hand. You had the gun up like this.
Right.
So this means that this is a position that is pointed up and not at anyone, correct?
Yes, at the instant of bullet contact, the weapon would not be pointing directly forward. That doesn't mean that a split second earlier it was not. It just means that at the instant of bullet contact, you have an upward angling of the weapon.
Okay, well, I think you gave us about 4 scenarios where you consistently had the gun always up in this fashion, and you had it up in this fashion because your testimony to Your Honor was that the only way in order for Corey to sustain that fatal gunshot wound to his chest is that he has to expose that right side, correct?
Right. I think there were 4 different scenarios, and one of them was 2 hands together, left hand on the gun, right hand supporting the left, and, with the added restriction that all 3 rounds would be received at that exact, in that instant in time. So, if you add those additional constraints, then yes, the firearm is angled up, his arms are elevated, he's exposed the right side of his chest, and it allows the trajectories to go through the arms in the fashion we just talked about.
Okay. But if someone is pointing a gun at someone, Dr. Marraccini, they're not holding it up like this. They're pointing it at someone.
Yeah, unless they have a change of heart or the gun doesn't go off. I mean, it's my recollection that this round is not chambered in this weapon, so.
You talking about Corey's weapon?
Correct.
Exactly. And the safety was on, correct?
Right, so the point is, if one's in a position that you pull the trigger and nothing happens, then you go from pointing to something else because things aren't working out.
Now, aside from the 4 demonstrations that you gave us of him having this gun in his left hand, in order for him because you're aware that he's left-handed, so now you got to figure out a way to match it up so that there's an answer for why he would have sustained that gunshot wound to his right side. If he doesn't have a gun, and let's say he is running, hypothetically speaking, he doesn't have a gun, and he is running away from the defendant. When he runs away, and he runs into, let's say, this tree line area, and he's about 64 yards away from where the defendant is, somewhere in that area. If he's running and he's trying to dodge because he sees someone shooting at him, isn't it possible that while he's running, he's trying to figure, and you demonstrated this a few minutes ago, that maybe he's trying to grab onto some trees, or he's trying to hold on to some trees, or he's trying to cover himself by some trees so that he won't get shot by gunfire from this defendant. Isn't that possible as well?
Sure.
So when he actually sustains that gunshot wound, that fatal gunshot wound to his left hand, the right side of his chest, there is absolutely nothing in the evidence that supports that at the time he did that, at the time that he sustained that gunshot wound, that he actually had a gun pointed at the defendant. Is there?
No, I can only say what's consistent, not what actually happened.
Okay. Now, you indicated a few minutes ago also, Dr. Marraccini, that if a person, that all three wounds could be received at the same time.
Well, I'm saying that's possible. You could work the scenario and make it so.
Right. So all 3 wounds could be received at the same time.
Right. I showed a left-handed scenario where all 3 rounds were received in the twinkling of an eye. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And when you showed that scenario where all 3 wounds could have been sustained at the same time, that was with you having the gun up in this fashion again as well, right? Because
Well, that is what I demonstrated, yes.
okay, and that is the only way that he sustained all 3 at the same time, because that is the only way that right side is exposed, correct?
Well, it's not the only way. It's the way where I gave like 4 or 5 scenarios, and that's one of the scenarios that works with the physical evidence in this particular case.
Now, you indicated a little while ago also that after he receives the gunshot wound, the fatal gunshot wound to his chest, when we're talking about the laceration to his pulmonary artery, the laceration to his aorta, hypothetically speaking, when someone sustains that type of injury to their heart, and I want to give you this analogy, isn't it like, for instance, if you have water coming out of a water hose, and all of a sudden you take that water hose and you bend it, and it cuts off the water completely. Isn't it similar to that? The type of injury that Corey sustained to his heart? That
Well,
as soon as he receives that gunshot wound to the chest, the blood flow stops.
Well, I gave the worst case scenario where the blood pressure goes to zero right away. That's not always the case. As a matter of fact, I have a case illustration in the literature. You know, we see this in the trauma center, where this is an angiogram of someone shot through the aorta, and, you know, they make it, and they live a while, and they get an angiogram, and the surgeon goes in and fixes it. So, you know, if their blood pressure was zero at the scene for, you know, even, you know, 15 or 20 minutes, they wouldn't be arriving at the right or trauma to get an angiogram. So not always does the blood pressure go to zero immediately. But nevertheless, for purposes of this particular discussion, I'm assuming his blood pressure is zero, and he's operating on the 10 to 15 seconds of brain oxygen.
Okay. And are you taking into account that Corey is facing someone with a gun pointed at him, who is telling him he's in a very high stress, very confrontational situation. So what Corey does is he turns around and he runs. And when he runs away, he's already exerting energy. Would you agree with that? That someone running is exerting energy.
Well, I'd run too, so yes.
Okay. So if he's already in a posture where he is exerting energy because he is trying to get away from this defendant who is shooting at him, once he gets down by that tree line, he's already exerted a lot of energy. When he is, for the most part, 64 yards away from his vehicle, he has already exerted a lot of energy by running down into that area. Would you agree with that?
Well, he's exerted the amount of energy you typically exert, let's say, for a 50-meter run and 50-meter dash. I mean, that's how much it is if people remember how it was to run, you know, those kinds of sprints.
Okay. And you talked about, well, my question to you is, he's already exerting energy as he's running away.
That is correct.
Right. So once he gets down farther, and if he does not sustain that gunshot wound to the chest until he is further away from where the initial shots began, then at the moment that he does receive that fatal injury to his chest, he's not going to be able to go much farther because he's already exerted a lot of energy by running away, trying to get away from the gunfire initially. Would you agree with that?
Not really. I mean, you know, the energy number is not that large. You're talking about a young, healthy person, not, you know, some elderly person. So, you know, in the threat of gunfire, people run a mile and they go and go and go. You know, if they're not hit by anything, they just go.
All right. And you say when people are hit by gunfire, but I am talking specifically about the injury to Corey Jones's heart. I'm talking about his injury. I'm not talking about anybody else's heart injury. I'm talking about the major damage that was done to his heart.
I don't think muscle fatigue plays an important role in this particular case in this individual who's young and healthy. I mean, I think the most significant factor is the damage to the, you know, the aorta, heart, aorta, and pulmonary artery. And him, you know, his muscles getting tired, I honestly think is a non-issue in this particular case.
Well, if you sustain that type of injury to the aorta and the pulmonary artery, I mean, those are vital organs. That is your heart.
Well, it's a vital organ. We all agree. But what I'm saying is you're running, when you do a sprint, you're mainly running on glycogen and stored muscle sugar, basically. And it doesn't really rely that much on the air you breathe in the first 50 meters. So the point I'm trying to make is, in this particular case, with the numbers and distances, I just don't see that muscle fatigue or general exertion in this young individual is going to add anything.
So it's your testimony that the heart, Corey Jones's heart, being impacted in the way that it was impacted, he has already exerted a lot of energy running away. It's your testimony that he could still continue to run several yards, several feet, a city block. Is that your testimony?
Well, I'm going to say specifically that it's consistent with him running the entire 192 or 160-foot distance involved in this particular case. You know, I'm not challenged to render a city block opinion. I'm just saying he's capable of running the whole distance, even after the cardiovascular gunshot wound we just talked about.
Okay. So the amount of energy being exerted at the time of the impact has no bearing on the rate in which the heart will ultimately cease to function and impact the person's abilities.
What I'm saying is I assume the worst case scenario, that the blood pressure goes to 0. And that was the basis of my calculation. So functionally the heart is not working, and that was the basis of my opinion. So like I said, I think we've already spoken to the cardiovascular injury. I don't really see the issue of exertion in this young individual as being that significant at all.
And you indicated a few minutes ago that you did not agree with Dr. Juice, who was the medical examiner in this case, who actually performed the autopsy.
That's correct.
You don't agree with the fact that she's saying that he would not be able to travel any more than a few yards.
Yes, I do not agree with Dr. Juice's opinion regarding his activity after receiving the lethal gunshot.
Okay. Now, I mean, ideally, when someone comes in, when a medical examiner comes in or a forensic pathologist comes in to provide testimony, I mean, ideally, it's best if that person, it helps more or supports your testimony more if you yourself had done the autopsy, correct?
Well, if the autopsy is not adequately documented, then the person doing the autopsy has a better look than the people who review it. But in this particular case, Dr. Juice did an adequate job of documenting the autopsy, both with her autopsy report and with photography, as she is charged to do as her duties as a medical examiner. So if the medical examiner does her job, then the evidence is sufficient for outside experts to render a second opinion. And that's the whole reason for doing a body diagram and doing an autopsy report and taking pictures. I mean, in theory, the medical examiner could look at the body and say, yep, they're dead, gunshot wounds, that's it, sign the death certificate. But you're asked to document so that others can review and assess what's going on.
Okay. But you would agree that there's nothing like having performed the autopsy yourself. I mean, you get that first-hand knowledge. You're looking down into the cavity, the person's body. I mean, you have a perspective. If you are doing the autopsy yourself, you have a perspective that no other medical examiner or forensic pathologist is going to have, no matter how many pictures you look at. Is that right?
They could see better than we can reviewing the materials.
Okay. And, for instance, if you are, let's say, treating a patient with some sort of chronic illness, and they wanted to get a second opinion, which many people do all the time, correct?
Yes.
I mean, someone is diagnosed with unfortunately cancer or some terminal illness. It is not uncommon for that person to seek out a second and sometimes even a third opinion, right?
Of course.
And when they seek out that second or third opinion, it's not that the records of the person are just sent over to that doctor. That doctor, who is ever the second or third doctor, wants to see the patient, right?
Well, yeah, and the main reason is that the second and third doctor wants to take the history all over again.
Right.
In this particular case, unfortunately, the history is given to us from the investigation information. So, unfortunately, the victim, we have, there's no one given an opportunity to ask what really happened again. So, as consultants in forensic pathology, unfortunately, we have to rely upon facts as they already are and give a second opinion. So obviously diagnosis is probably easier on living patients than it is on the deceased for the reasons we just talked about.
Okay. And so the person that's in the best position to determine what Corey was able to do, was not able to do, is the person who is looking down in him, who extracted his heart from his chest and examined it. And that would be Dr. Juice, right?
Well, they're in the best position to document, but not necessarily in the best position to render an opinion as to activities at the scene. That's an inference. That's not something you see with your eyeballs, what someone did at the scene of death. That's something you have to do as an interpretation or opinion.
Last, and I want to go back to a scenario that you gave a few minutes ago, because you said with Mr. Lubin, you indicated that, for instance, Corey's running, no weapon whatsoever in his hand, and one of the scenarios you gave is that he's running, he pivots, he turns back to address the situation with his arms up, trying to get away from gunfire. Right?
Well, there's two elements to what you said. There's A, retreat, and B, an assessment. And the assessment, I don't know what was in his mind at the time, but, he could be A, I'm going to look back and see if he's getting closer, or B, I'm going to look back and see if I can take a shot, or C, other. So I'm just saying, all we know is he's running, his body is tilted one way, he's pivoting a bit, he's taking a look. That's all, that would be a reasonable assessment. Now, what other additional things he was doing or thinking, I cannot say.
And when he's running, assessing, pivoting, taking a look, all of that is without him having a gun in his hand.
Well, I don't know if he had a gun in his hand or not.
Okay. Well, if the gun is about 40 yards away from where he's running, pivoting, turning around, and taking a look, it's possible, right?
Well, I'm not sure he was 4 yards away from that point. I mean, he could have been standing near where the gun was dropped when the second volley of gunfire occurred. So I don't really, I'm losing the connection here. He's down in the swale on the grass.
Well, if he's shot, you said with that left arm, that left arm, if he's holding the gun in that left hand, you said that his left arm would immediately become disabled.
It would become disabled, and in a short period of time, maybe right away, maybe in several seconds, the weapon is likely to be dropped.
Okay. So if the weapon is dropped, and then there is about another 40 yards where he goes to, then we know he doesn't have a weapon at that point.
Your Honor, object to a hypothetical for which there is absolutely nothing in the record to support.
Overruled.
Well, assuming the weapon started out in the left hand, assuming he shot through the arm, on or near where the weapon's dropped on the ground, At that point in time, he does not have a weapon in his possession, assuming those facts are true.
Judge, may I have a moment, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Nothing further. Thank you, Dr. Marraccini.
Redirect?
Dr. Marraccini, the counsel started out by questioning you about one of the various scenarios that you talked about in which all three wounds happened in the same volley. And it was during that one that you had the right arm up in the air without a gun in it, I think. Is that what you were saying?
Right.
Okay. There are untold dozens of scenarios where the fatal wound, or I meant the left arm up there. There are untold dozens of scenarios where the fatal wound was inflicted with a gun in either the right or the left hand of the deceased, correct?
Right, and there's also the snapshot phenomenon that, 1/3 of a second earlier, the weapon's pointed in one direction, and 1/3 of a second later, when the counterfire occurs, the weapon is pointed more upward. So, in terms of what's actually happening in the moment, you take into account that you're looking at, frames in a film, so to speak, and it happens very rapidly.
But
So,
in other words, there is nothing inconsistent here with the fatal wound having been inflicted while Mr. Jones was pointing a gun with the right hand or the left hand at Officer Raja, correct?
right, it's just his arms just have to be out of the way at the moment that the bullet is traveling and striking him on the right side of the chest.
And the one scenario that you were asked about, the only one that you were asked about your demonstration, was the one scenario that you demonstrated about how all three wounds could have occurred at the same time.
Right. I was asking if you had to put it all together in one volley, but there's no reason to put it together in one volley in this particular case. It was just one of 4 or 5 scenarios that we went through and talked about.
But literally, there could have been 20 or 30 scenarios with these three wounds having occurred, correct?
That is correct.
And on the scenario that you demonstrated without a gun in the left hand, but with the left hand up, there's nothing inconsistent with either there being a gun in the left hand or a gun in the right hand also. Correct?
Right.
Okay. Now, you mentioned it just now that all of this is an instant in time, and we're freeze framing it. But when there's fluidity, there's no telling when the shot was fired by Officer Raja, what he was perceiving was happening, and then by the time the shot was inflicted, there could have been a slight movement in the arms or the body of Mr. Jones. Correct?
Right. I mean, and officers only have a certain reaction time. I mean, there's been a bunch of studies here, but, the reaction time could be a quarter second, third of a second, longer than that, depending on what's going on. And I think you have other experts who can speak to that.
And when that occurs, though, the exact position of the arms or the twisting of the body, it can be different than it was when you pulled the trigger or when you decided to pull the trigger, correct?
Right, and it's like watching a video of some sports event that you have to watch 3 times to figure out what actually happened. Movements are quick, and that's under a condition of excellent lighting, as opposed to not so excellent lighting in this particular case.
And you're not suggesting, are you, that the fatal wound would have occurred in this case in either of the two scenarios? There's no way of knowing which.
Or any of the 4 scenarios or any of the 6 scenarios,
But I
right.
mean-
This is just one example that fits the physical wounds among several that was demonstrated before the court.
And that one was assuming that all 3 wounds occurred at the same volley, correct? That one, that we were just talking about.
Right, that was giving you the most constrained of all possible interpretations of the gunfire.
And if a person receives a gunshot wound while they're holding a gun, that person it presumably is a threat whether the gun is pointing at the person or up in the air, correct?
Well, it's a police procedural question that I'll let other experts address.
And this was a question that was asked of you, and I want to ask it again. Nothing in the evidence supports that Corey Jones was holding the gun in his right hand. Are you aware that the only evidence in this case is that Corey Jones was holding the gun in his right hand, and that was supplied by Officer Raja, who said he had a gun in his right hand and he turned it at me and I fired? Are you
Right, I'm aware of that statement.
And that there is no evidence whatsoever in the record in this case that says that on this night, at that time, that Mr. Jones was holding a gun in his left hand, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And your opinion that you were just asked about how Mr. Jones might have traveled, a long distance or a good distance after receiving the fatal wound is fully supported by the literature and your experience, correct?
Right, the literature goes back decades. It's in standard textbooks. It's not obscure research at all.
And so the literature is clear that, and forensic pathologists should know that, correct? That after receiving a fatal wound such as this, that the person can travel, as you said, it could be blocks, but at least in this case, 196 feet, correct?
Right, I mean, you could have an opinion that's different than all the literature, but you ought to have a foundation for it.
And there's nothing in the record, and nor are you commenting on, at what point Mr. Jones had a gun and in which hand, correct? You
Well, I mean,
don't know which hand.
the thing that's in the record is that he had the gun in his right hand.
Okay, thank you. Your indulgence. No further questions.
Okay, I have a couple questions for the doctor. So, based on all the evidence that you reviewed, is it more likely that the fatal gunshot wound, which was here, right, underneath the front chest area, correct?
More to the right, yeah.
More to the right side chest area?
Yes, ma'am.
Is it more likely that Corey Jones was facing the shooter or running away from the shooter?
Well, I mean, how shall I put this? I think the term law enforcement uses is bladed. In other words, if you're wielding a weapon in your right hand and you're presenting your right side, that's called, the law enforcement uses the term bladed. It means that you're presenting the narrowest part of your body in profile to the other person, the shooter. So there's no reason why, you don't have to assume running. All you have to assume is a backward tilt of the shooter, of the person receiving gunfire to make that shot fit. Did I make myself clear?
So they have to be standing sideways and tilted backwards?
Yeah, sideways and tilted away from gunfire. Now, it doesn't prove they're running. It could be an individual who is about to go into a run and beginning the process of both running away and pointing. Or it could be in, other things. I wasn't there, so I can't say what actually happened physically.
Okay. All right, so after the fatal shot, and there was a lot of testimony about the amount of time, and somebody could potentially run a mile. It just depends on a couple different factors. So, I mean, does weight play into it? Does an individual's weight or their physical fitness, or I think you mentioned age? Does it depend on what, if they had caffeine that day? Are there a lot of different variables that would determine, what are some of the other variables that would determine whether somebody could actually continue activity or some prolonged activity for more than 10 to 15 seconds?
Well, let me just clarify. When I said run a mile, I meant someone who had not been hit by gunfire but was being shot at.
Okay.
So,
Or I think
so
you said-
yeah, I mean, like, I'm an older guy, and if I got hit by the same round in the same way, I probably wouldn't go as far as this gentleman did because I'm not as healthy. I'm older. But, this is, for all intents and purposes, a young, healthy individual. So, I expect him to have the full blessing of, youth, health, and strength, and to, like soldiers in battle who are also generally young and healthy, they could go a considerable distance after their lethal cardiovascular injury.
Okay. And just one more question. The lethal wound to the chest, you testified, did not exit, right?
That's correct.
So is that more consistent with a closer range shot, farther away shot, or it doesn't matter, the distance of the shot?
In this particular case, it's not important. And the reason it's not important is the round of ammunition, and it doesn't slow down all that much whether the range of fire is 5 feet versus another 50 yards through the air. It's not that decisive. The design of these bullets is that they should penetrate at least 12 inches. But, that there isn't going to be a lot of difference in the physical distances involved in this particular case.
Okay. Based on those questions, defense or state, do you have any further questions?
I do. I just want to go back to the question that Her Honor asked you, Dr. Marraccini, at the first. I think she asked the fatal wound, is it consistent with running away? But actually, if a person is actually turned away and running, the body would not have been in a position to receive that fatal wound, correct?
Right. I mean, he's not presenting his back to the gunfire. He's presenting his right side to the gunfire.
To get the fatal wound.
In order to acquire the fatal wound. We showed some scenarios where you could be running, you could be tilting away to run, or you could just be leaning back in surprise, or a variety. But you have to present the right side of your body, more or less, to gunfire, either in the bladed fashion that we talked about, in the manner of, Olympic target shooting, or whatever you want to call it.
So in other words, if a person is just running away from you, they couldn't receive this fatal wound in that stance.
If their upper body is perpendicular to the line of fire, meaning, if there's a bullet striking me perpendicular to my body, it's not going to have the effect that we saw in this particular case.
But if
You have to present the right side in some way, shape, or form and tilted to collect this round in the right place with the right angle.
And that's consistent with somebody holding a gun in their right hand.
Right. And it could be with presenting a weapon or not presenting a weapon.
And also, you've said a couple of times that the body would have to be tilted, but actually the shooter could have the gun at a lower position and the body wouldn't have to be tilted, correct?
Well, if they're substantially closer. If the range of fire, if we're now talking about a range of fire measured only in, 3 or 4 yards, and if the shooter is beginning the shooting from a down position and bringing the gun up for a succession of shots, then you can get some upward trajectory.
But it's just a question of distance and angle. So in other words, if the person is 20 yards away, then the angle wouldn't have to be as great as if they were 5 yards away in order to inflict an upward.
Well, if they're 20 yards away, the bullet, for all intents and purposes, is more or less parallel to the ground. There isn't much upward trajectory. So you have to, yes, you can get some upward trajectory, but now you aren't getting much.
Thank you. No further questions.
That's just one question.
Okay, and I have a question also, but go ahead.
You want to ask yours first?
Sure. The leaning back, I mean, and you kind of mentioned this, but I just want to understand a little bit better. The leaning back, and obviously, you know, you testified that the arm couldn't be in the way of, or otherwise the fatal shot would have gone through the arm and then through the chest, right? So, and the arm up, is that more consistent with somebody defending themselves from a shot? An offensive, are they on the offensive or on the defensive? Or are you not able to tell from the evidence? I mean, the question I have is why would an individual be leaning back? Because they're running, moving, or are they defending themselves? What?
I think if I were running and trying to shoot at someone at the same time, I might adopt a posture like that. That's one example, but it's just one of many. I mean, he could just be, you know, trying to accelerate and move away when he collects that round, period, end of story. So, you know, and looking back a bit, you know, not giving his whole back, but he could, you know, beginning to move out, you know, you lower your center of gravity, you lean on your forward foot, but, you know, since there's a threat behind you and it's not just a walk in the park, you're looking back at the same time. You tilt the upper torso away.
Okay, Steve?
And that example that you just gave, that would be without him having a weapon.
Correct.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that. Or having a weapon.
Right, either way. It doesn't say what the right arm is doing. It talks about upper posture, the body's upper posture, and the tilt.
Okay, anything else, anybody? No? Okay, thank you, doctor. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And we're going to take a break now. It's 10:04. We're going to come back at 10:20, please. Thank you so much.
Where is the recess?